The VIP lounge at Ethergate Spaceport fell silent the moment Corbin Hawthorne snapped his fingers at the man mopping the floor. "Hey, mop boy, don't breathe near my shoes." Carter Miles tightened his grip on the handle, swallowed hard, and kept his eyes down. From the service entrance, little Bonnie peeked through the gap, her small fingers clutching her backpack straps until her knuckles turned white. Corbin smirked, holding up a sponsorship contract like a trophy. "One word from me, and you're out on the street." At that exact moment, the glass elevator chimed. Henry Caldwell, the founding CEO, stepped out and looked straight into Bonnie's eyes. He took the contract from Corbin's hand, and in 10 seconds flat, he tore it to shreds. The entire room stopped breathing. Corbin's face turned the color of ash. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethergate Spaceport hummed to life with the kind of tension that precedes history. This was dress rehearsal day, the final countdown before humanity's latest venture into commercial space tourism would either cement Ethergate's legacy or burn it to the ground. Every soul inside those gleaming walls understood the stakes. One miscalculation, one overlooked detail, and decades of dreams would scatter like dust in a solar wind. The VIP lounge occupied the highest floor of the observation tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of Launch Pad 7 and the sleek vessel that would carry 12 paying passengers beyond the atmosphere. LED countdown displays flickered with numbers that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The hiss of climate-controlled air mixed with the crackle of radio chatter from mission control. Everything in this room cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The imported marble floors, the crystal glasses arranged on titanium serving trays, the Ethergate logo etched into brushed metal walls that caught the light like frozen lightning. Carter Miles pushed his cleaning cart through the service corridor, his rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished concrete. His uniform was simple gray coveralls with the company logo stitched small over his heart. Disposable gloves that made his hands sweat, and a laminated badge that identified him as nothing more than a number in the maintenance department. He had learned long ago that men like him were supposed to be invisible. The wealthy guests who passed through these halls looked right through him as if he were made of glass. That invisibility had become his armor, his protection, his way of surviving in a world that had already chewed him up and spit him out once before. He spotted a small puddle near the entrance to the VIP area condensation from the climate system. Nothing dangerous, but enough to cause a slip if someone walked too fast in expensive shoes. Carter knelt and began wiping it away with practiced efficiency. No streaks, no residue, no reason for anyone to complain. That was the goal every single day. Get through the shift without incident. Pick up Bonnie from the service entrance where she waited during his early morning hours. Take her to school. Come back. Repeat. It wasn't much of a life, but it was the only life he had left. His daughter had no business being here, but Carter had no other choice. The babysitter had canceled at midnight with a text message that offered no explanation, and calling in sick meant losing the job entirely. So 7-year-old Bonnie sat tucked behind a maintenance door, her backpack serving as a pillow, her eyes too bright and too watchful for a child her age. She had learned to be quiet. She had learned to be invisible, just like her father. Every few minutes, Carter glanced toward that door, making sure she was still there, still safe, still unnoticed by the parade of executives and engineers rushing past with their important problems and their expensive clothes. Amanda Chen, the head of public relations, hurried by with a wireless earpiece glowing blue against her dark hair. Her heels clicked a frantic rhythm as she spoke into thin air. "I don't care what the tabloids want. No interviews until after successful orbit. One leak about that fuel cell rumor, and we're finished. Do you understand?" Finished. She disappeared around a corner without so much as glancing at Carter. To her, he was part of the furniture, part of the walls, part of the background that existed only to support the important people doing important things. Bernie Thornton, chief of security, made his rounds with military precision. The former Marine walked like a man expecting trouble, his eyes cataloging every face, every badge, every potential threat. He nodded once at Carter, a rare acknowledgement that startled Carter every time it happened before continuing his patrol. Bernie remembered names. He noticed details. He treated the maintenance staff with the same professional respect he showed the executives. That made him unusual in ways that mattered more than Bernie probably realized. Ingrid Paulson emerged from the elevator looking like she hadn't slept in 3 days, because she probably hadn't. The lead systems engineer clutched a tablet displaying streams of data that would have meant nothing to most people, but clearly meant everything to her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten on a console somewhere between crisis and catastrophe. If we're off by 0.03 on the stabilization matrix, she muttered to no one in particular, the whole guidance system could drift. And if the guidance system drifts, we're looking at abort protocols at best, total mission failure at worst. She didn't seem to expect an answer. She was simply thinking out loud, the way brilliant people do when they've forgotten anyone else exists. The tension in the air grew thicker when Amanda's earpiece crackled with news that made her face tighten. A major sponsor had just landed on the helipad. Corbin Hawthorne, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, venture capitalist, and professional destroyer of anyone who dared to waste his time. His reputation preceded him like a cold front sweeping across the desert. Stories circulated through corporate circles about assistants fired for bringing lukewarm coffee, about competitors crushed through hostile takeovers that left entire companies in ruins, about a fundamental belief that money entitled him to treat other human beings as disposable props in his personal theater of wealth and power. The elevator doors parted like curtains on a stage, and Corbin Hawthorne made his entrance. He was younger than his reputation suggested, perhaps 40, with the kind of lean physique that came from personal trainers and private chefs, and the absolute certainty that his body deserved the best care money could buy. His suit probably cost more than Carter earned in 6 months of mopping floors and cleaning toilets and pretending not to hear the jokes that executives made about the help. A watch glinted on his wrist, its face displaying complications that served no purpose except to announce wealth. Behind him trailed 2 assistants who carried tablets and worried expressions, their entire existence dedicated to anticipating his next demand before he voiced it. Corbin surveyed the VIP lounge with the air of a man inspecting property he intended to purchase. His gaze swept across the panoramic windows, the carefully arranged refreshments, the nervous executives who straightened their posture in his presence. He smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. Those eyes were calculating, measuring, searching for weakness, the way a predator scans a herd for the animal that will be easiest to take down. They landed on Carter Miles. The janitor had nearly finished cleaning the floor. He gathered his supplies, preparing to retreat into invisibility before anyone important noticed him. But Corbin noticed. Corbin always noticed the people society had trained him to see as beneath consideration. They were entertainment to him. They were opportunities to demonstrate power. And today, on this morning when tension already filled the air like static electricity before a storm, he was in the mood for entertainment. "Hey, mop boy." Carter froze. His shoulders tensed beneath the gray coveralls. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to pretend he hadn't heard, to disappear before the situation escalated into something worse. But Corbin's voice carried the particular edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately and without question. "Don't breathe near my shoes." Corbin lifted one Italian leather Oxford and examined it as if checking for contamination. "I just had these custom fitted in Milan. They're worth more than your annual salary. Probably worth more than your entire, miserable existence, if we're being honest." A few guests nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman in pearls actually laughed a nervous, ugly sound that encouraged Corbin to continue. That laugh told him the room was on his side, or at least too afraid to be on anyone else's. He took 2 steps closer to Carter, deliberately positioning himself so that his freshly polished shoes stood directly on the section of floor Carter had just cleaned. Missed a spot. Corbin dragged his heel across the marble, leaving a dark scuff mark like a signature of contempt. See? This is why some people push mops their whole lives. No attention to detail. No ambition. No value to anyone except as an example of what not to become. Carter knelt again. He had a daughter to feed. He had rent to pay. He had learned the hard way that pride was a luxury poor men couldn't afford, especially poor men with children depending on them. So he cleaned the scuff mark without a word, his jaw locked so tight his teeth ached, his hands moving with mechanical precision while his mind screamed at him to stand up, to fight back, to be a man. But he had forgotten about Bonnie. The little girl had been watching from the service entrance, her face pressed against the gap where the door didn't quite close. She had seen her father insulted by strangers before in grocery stores when they paid with coupons, on buses when people looked at their worn clothes, in the unemployment office during those terrible months when things were really bad. But she had never seen anyone look at him the way this man in the expensive suit was looking at him now, like he was nothing, like he was less than nothing, like he was something disgusting that had crawled out of a drain. Bonnie pushed the door open. She took 3 steps into the VIP lounge before she realized what she had done, before the enormity of her mistake crashed over her like a wave. Suddenly, every eye in the room turned toward the small girl in her faded pink jacket and second-hand sneakers, clutching a backpack covered in cartoon stickers that hadn't been popular in years. Corbin's smile widened. He had found new ammunition. Well, did you bring your kid to work, mop boy? His voice dripped with mock concern, with false sympathy that fooled no one. That's against about 15 different safety regulations, isn't it? Unless he paused dramatically, turning to address the watching executives like an actor playing to the cheap seats. Unless he's hoping the sight of a pathetic child will make someone feel sorry enough to slip him a few extra dollars. Is that it? Teaching her to beg early? Starting the family tradition young? Bonnie's eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She understood that this man was hurting her father. She understood that everyone was watching and no one was helping. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her voice had disappeared. Carter rose slowly. His hands shook, not with fear, but with the effort of containing something far more dangerous. He had survived worse than this. He had endured humiliation from men with more power than Corbin Hawthorne could imagine. But watching his daughter tremble under that cruel gaze, watching tears streak down her small face, ignited something he had buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. "My daughter isn't part of this," he said quietly. "Your daughter is whatever I say she is." Corbin pulled a leather folder from his assistant's hands and held it up like a weapon. Inside was a contract, the sponsorship agreement that would secure $20 million in funding for Ethergate's next phase of expansion. "You see this? One signature, and your bosses live another year. One phone call to my lawyers, and I can have this entire company audited until it bleeds." He pointed the folder at Carter like the barrel of a gun. "So yes, mop boy, your daughter is exactly what I say she is. And right now, she's a health code violation I could use to have you fired before lunch." Amanda watched from across the room, her face pale as paper. She knew the math. Ethergate needed Hawthorne's money desperately. The board had made that abundantly clear in dozens of meetings where spreadsheets replaced human decency as the primary concern. Losing this sponsorship could mean layoffs, delayed launches, possibly bankruptcy. But watching Corbin torment a man in front of his child made her stomach turn in ways spreadsheets never could. She wanted to speak up. She wanted to intervene. But the words stuck in her throat, and she hated herself for the silence. The elevator chimed. Everyone heard it. That single, clear note cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. The doors slid open, and Henry Caldwell stepped into the light. He was not a physically imposing man. At 63, Henry carried the slight stoop of someone who had spent too many years hunched over blueprints and computer screens, chasing dreams that most people thought were impossible. His hair had gone silver years ago. His suits were expensive but never flashy, the kind of clothes worn by someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. What made Henry Caldwell formidable was something harder to define. He had built Ethergate from a sketch on a napkin, had weathered 3 market crashes, had buried a wife and a son, and emerged from grief with a quiet determination that bordered on terrifying. Henry did not look at Corbin first. He looked at Bonnie. The little girl stood frozen in the middle of the lounge, tears streaming down her cheeks, her backpack hanging from one shoulder like a broken wing. Henry's expression didn't change, it rarely did, but something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation. A decision. The same look he got when facing an engineering problem that needed solving, except this time the problem was human cruelty and the solution was simple. Then he looked at Carter. And finally, at Corbin. Mr. Caldwell. Corbin recovered quickly, arranging his features into a smile that was meant to convey respect but couldn't quite hide the irritation at being interrupted in the middle of his performance. I was just discussing some concerns with your staff about security protocols. You know how seriously I take safety when it comes to protecting my investments. Henry said nothing. He walked toward Corbin with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, unhurried, as if time itself had bent to accommodate his pace. The silence in the room grew so complete that people could hear the distant rumble of a transport vehicle crossing the tarmac outside. "The contract?" Henry said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "May I see it?" Corbin's smile twitched. This wasn't how the script usually went. Normally, when he waved money around, executives fell over themselves to accommodate him. They thanked him. They groveled. They offered him better terms and begged him to sign. But Henry Caldwell was looking at him the way a scientist examines a disappointing specimen with clinical detachment that somehow felt worse than anger. "Of course." Corbin handed over the leather folder with a flourish. $20 million, as discussed. Though I'll need some assurances about certain personnel decisions going forward. Starting with, he gestured toward Carter. Better screening for the service staff. We can't have just anyone wandering around a facility like this. Henry opened the folder. He examined the first page of the contract for exactly 3 seconds. Then he began to tear. The sound of ripping paper filled the silent room like gunfire, like the crack of something breaking that could never be repaired. Henry tore the contract in half, then quarters, then smaller pieces that fluttered to the marble floor like confetti at a funeral. 10 seconds. That's all it took to reduce $20 million in promised funding to scattered scraps of worthless paper. "Ethergate," Henry said, his voice never rising above conversational volume, "does not sell dignity to buy sponsorship." Corbin's face went through several colors in rapid succession, red with rage, then white with shock, then a mottled purple that suggested his blood pressure had entered dangerous territory. His mouth opened and closed twice before words emerged, and when they did, they sounded strangled, desperate. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice cracked like thin ice. "I will bury this company. I will make phone calls tonight that will have your board crawling to me on their knees by morning." Henry turned to Bernie Thornton, who had materialized at his elbow with the silent efficiency of long practice. "Please escort Mr. Hawthorne to the helipad. His business here is concluded." "You're making the worst mistake of your career," Corbin snarled as security personnel flanked him. "This isn't over, Caldwell. You hear me? This is just beginning." The elevator doors closed on his threats, cutting them off mid-sentence like a guillotine dropping. Henry stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the scattered pieces of contract on the floor. Then he walked over to where Bonnie still stood, trembling, and lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. "What's your name?" he asked. "Bonnie." Her voice was barely a whisper. "That's a beautiful name." Henry pulled a handkerchief from his pocket reel cloth, monogrammed, hopelessly old-fashioned, and offered it to her. "Bonnie, I want you to know something important. What that man said wasn't true. Your father works hard, and there's honor in that. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Carter watched this exchange with an expression that was impossible to read. Relief, certainly. Gratitude, probably. But underneath those expected emotions lurked something else, a dawning awareness that the reprieve might be temporary. That men like Corbin Hawthorne did not accept humiliation gracefully. The real battle hadn't ended. It had just begun. 3 hours later, the first alarm sounded. Ingrid Paulson was reviewing stabilization data when her tablet began flashing warnings she had never seen outside of simulation exercises. Moisture detection in Sector 7. Contamination risk near the guidance system housing. Temperature fluctuations in the environmental control grid. The readings made no sense. That area had been sealed and sterilized according to protocol just yesterday. "This is wrong," she muttered, fingers flying across the screen. "This has to be sensor malfunction. It has to be." But the numbers didn't lie. Something was very wrong in Sector 7, and whatever it was threatened to derail the entire mission. Bernie Thornton received the security alert 30 seconds later. His team pulled camera footage and began reviewing the past 12 hours of activity in the affected area. The images were grainy, compressed, clearly tampered with, but one figure appeared repeatedly in the fragments that remained intact. A man in gray coveralls pushing a cleaning cart. "Bring me Carter Miles," Bernie ordered. He didn't enjoy saying the words. His gut told him something was off about the whole situation, that the evidence was too convenient, too perfect. But protocol existed for reasons, and protocol demanded investigation. Carter was escorted to a holding room near the security office. They wouldn't let Bonnie stay with him. A woman from Human Resources took the girl to a waiting area with vending machines and plastic chairs, promising that everything would be fine, that Daddy would be back soon. Bonnie didn't believe her. Neither did Carter. Meanwhile, Bonnie sat alone in that sterile waiting room, her feet dangling above the floor because the chairs were made for adults. She could hear voices through the walls, urgent, worried voices that made her stomach hurt. One of Corbin's assistants walked past the glass partition, saw her sitting there, and stopped long enough to say something cruel. "Your daddy's in big trouble, little girl. People who break things go to jail. That's what happens to people like you." The assistant walked away smiling. Bonnie pressed her hands against her ears and tried not to cry. "Walk me through your morning," Bernie said, sitting across from Carter in the sterile interrogation room. Carter complied. He had nothing to hide, so he hid nothing. But as he described his route, he began to notice the trap taking shape around him like a net drawing tight. The areas he had cleaned corresponded almost perfectly to the locations showing anomalous readings. Someone had studied his schedule. Someone had mapped his movements. Someone had set this up with surgical precision. "I didn't do this," Carter said. "I want to believe you." Bernie leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing. "But the evidence says otherwise. Camera footage puts you in Sector 7 during the contamination window. Your access badge logged into 3 restricted areas. And somehow, the only person who benefits from sabotaging this launch just happens to be the same person who got humiliated in front of 50 witnesses this morning." Corbin Hawthorne. Bernie raised an eyebrow. You're accusing a major sponsor of industrial sabotage? He's not a sponsor anymore." Carter's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone distant, focused on memories he had spent years trying to bury. "And I'm not accusing. I'm stating what I've seen before." "What do you mean, before?" Carter was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects. Somewhere in the building, alarms continued to pulse as technicians scrambled to assess the damage. "I used to work in safety inspection," he said finally. "Aerospace certification, high-pressure systems, launch protocols, environmental controls, that was my specialty. 8 years with a company you've definitely heard of. Working my way up from junior analyst to senior inspector, until I made the mistake of finding a problem nobody wanted found." Bernie listened without interrupting. He had interrogated enough people over the years to know when someone was telling the truth and when they were spinning fiction. Carter Miles was telling the truth. They were cutting corners on pressure seals to meet a deadline. "I documented everything, reported it to management, assumed someone would care that people might die if those seals failed." A bitter smile crossed Carter's face. "Instead, they buried the evidence, fired me for falsifying records, and made sure I couldn't work in the industry again. I lost my career, lost my wife when the stress became too much for our marriage, lost everything except Bonnie. So, yeah, I push a mop now. But I didn't forget how to read data. And what you're describing in Sector 7 moisture contamination in a climate-controlled area, readings that don't match environmental conditions, that's not an accident. That's induced interference." Induced interference. Bernie turned the phrase over like a coin he was examining for counterfeits. "You're saying someone deliberately caused this. I'm saying the pattern doesn't match natural system failure. It matches external sabotage designed to create a crisis. And if you want to find the real culprit, you need to stop looking at who was there and start looking at who benefits." The countdown clock on the launch display showed 11 hours and 42 minutes remaining. Ingrid Paulson hadn't slept since the alarms started. Her team had isolated the affected systems, traced the anomalous readings to their source, and discovered something that made her blood run cold. The contamination wasn't organic. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was deliberate interference from a device that had no business being anywhere near guidance system hardware. A small, sophisticated piece of equipment designed to induce false readings in environmental sensors. "This is military-grade jamming tech," she reported to Henry Caldwell in a hastily convened crisis meeting. "Modified for civilian systems, probably purchased through intermediary contractors to hide the source. Whoever planted this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't amateur sabotage. This is professional." Henry's face betrayed nothing, but his hands gripped the armrests of his chair with unusual force. "Can we trace the device?" "Already working on it. Serial numbers were filed off, but the firmware has digital signatures. If we can match those signatures to a known supplier, do it fast." Henry turned to Amanda. "What's the media situation?" Amanda's expression suggested the media situation was approximately equivalent to a dumpster fire during a hurricane. 3 journalists have already called asking about safety concerns. Someone leaked photos of the security lockdown. And she hesitated. Corbin Hawthorne released a statement expressing his deep concern about Aethergate's ability to ensure passenger safety. He's offered to provide emergency technical support from his own contractors, conditional on renewed partnership discussions. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Corbin wasn't just retaliating. He was attempting a hostile takeover through manufactured crisis, create the problem, then present himself as the only solution. "He's forcing your hand," Bernie said. "Either you accept his help and give him control, or you miss the launch window and the board loses confidence. Either way, he wins." "Not necessarily." Henry's voice was soft, but it carried an edge that made everyone pay attention. "Still in holding." We haven't filed formal charges yet. Bring him here. Bernie hesitated. Sir, he's still technically a suspect. Bring him here. Now, Carter entered the executive conference room 15 minutes later, still wearing his gray coveralls, still carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to survive without expecting fairness. He looked around at the assembled executives, Amanda with her crisis management files, Ingrid with her technical readouts, Bernie with his security protocols, Henry with his unreadable expression, and waited. Miss Paulson, Henry said. Show him the device. Ingrid projected an image onto the wall screen. The jamming equipment had been photographed in situ before removal, a small black box tucked behind a junction panel, wires spliced into the sensor network with professional precision. Carter studied the image in silence. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he spoke without being asked. That's a cascade inducer. Modified version. I've seen the original design in classified technical manuals during my certification years. It doesn't create contamination. It makes sensors think contamination exists. The goal isn't to damage the system. It's to force a shutdown that looks legitimate, that looks like your own equipment failed. How do you know that? Amanda asked. Because I spent years certifying systems against exactly this kind of attack. Carter moved closer to the screen, pointing to specific components. See this relay configuration? It's designed to trigger secondary alerts once the primary sensors flag anomalies. Creates a snowball effect. One false reading leads to another until the whole network thinks there's a crisis. But the actual hardware is fine. Probably never was compromised. Ingrid pulled up her own analysis on an adjacent screen. He's right. I ran diagnostics on the underlying systems. Everything checks out except for the sensor layer that was directly connected to this device. Henry nodded slowly. Can you fix it? Carter hesitated. I can identify what's been done. Fixing it. He glanced at Ingrid. That's her department. But I can tell you exactly what to look for and how to verify the repair. If you're willing to let a janitor near your technical documentation, I'm willing to let a man with the right skills do the job that needs doing. Henry stood up. Miss Paulson, give him access. Mr. Thornton, assign 2 security officers to observe but not interfere. Miss Chen, start preparing a press statement about how Ethergate detected and neutralized an attempted act of corporate sabotage. Sir Amanda looked uncertain. If we go public with accusations against Hawthorne, we won't accuse, we'll describe. Facts first, implications later. Let the evidence speak for itself. Henry turned to leave, then paused at the door. And Carter? Find something we can use. Something that puts an end to this permanently. Carter found it 4 hours later. The device's firmware contained encrypted metadata that Ingrid's team managed to crack with help from a contractor who owed Henry a favor. The digital signature traced back to a defense technology company that had been quietly acquired by Hawthorne Industries 3 years earlier. Email records subpoenaed through an emergency court order, when the connection became clear, revealed a chain of communication that stretched from Corbin's personal assistant to a shell company to a security consultant who specialized in competitive intelligence operations. The evidence was damning. The evidence was complete, and the evidence arrived in Corbin Hawthorne's lap approximately 6 hours before launch, delivered by federal investigators who had been monitoring his communications since the first hints of corporate espionage emerged. Corbin had returned to the spaceport one final time, believing his leverage was absolute, believing that Henry would have no choice but to accept his terms. He walked into the executive conference room with a smile on his face and demands on his lips. The smile disappeared when he saw the federal agents waiting for him. It vanished entirely when Amanda played the recording of his own voice, captured through metadata recovery. instructing his team to create a crisis that would force Ethergate to its knees. "This is fabricated," Corbin sputtered, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. "This is a setup. My lawyers will destroy every one of you. Mr. Hawthorne." One of the federal agents stepped forward with handcuffs. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit industrial sabotage, corporate espionage, and interference with aviation safety systems. You have the right to remain silent." Carter watched from a distance as security personnel escorted Corbin from the Ethergate property for the second time that day. The billionaire's face had lost all color. His perfectly tailored suit seemed to hang looser on his frame, as if the mere proximity of consequences had caused him to shrink. He shouted threats about lawyers and lawsuits and revenge, but the words sounded hollow now, like echoes in an empty room that no one was listening to anymore. "Mr. Miles?" Carter turned to find Henry Caldwell standing behind him, hands clasped behind his back, watching the same scene unfold. "Sir, Bernie tells me you were the one who identified the Cascade inducer, that you knew what to look for because you'd seen this kind of sabotage before, something like it." "Same principle," Henry nodded slowly. "He also tells me that you lost a career because you refused to sign off on unsafe systems, that you traded everything you'd built for the right to tell the truth." Carter said nothing. The words felt too big for the moment, too heavy to lift. "I looked into your history," Henry continued. "Made some calls to people I trust. The people who framed you are no longer in positions of authority. The company that fired you eventually failed its safety certification and lost 3 contracts. You were vindicated, quietly, unofficially, years too late to matter. I stopped caring about vindication a long time ago." Carter's voice was rough. "I just wanted to keep my daughter fed, keep a roof over our heads, keep moving forward one day at a time." Henry was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, the launch vehicle stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its lights blinking in countdown sequence as the final preparations resumed. "I'm offering you a job," Henry said finally. "Safety consultant, quality assurance oversight. Whatever title works best for your skills and experience. The salary will be approximately 4 times what you currently earn, with full benefits, on-site childcare, and a clear path towards senior positions if you want them." Carter stared at him. "Why?" "Because I watched you kneel down and clean a floor while a man insulted you in front of your daughter, and you didn't break. Because I watched you sit in an interrogation room accused of sabotage, and instead of defending yourself, you explained how the sabotage was done. Because you have knowledge that my company needs and character that my company deserves." Henry paused. "And because my grandson would have been Bonnie's age this year, if he had lived. Some debts can't be repaid directly, they can only be passed forward." Carter considered the offer in silence. He thought about all the years he had spent being invisible, about all the insults he had swallowed to keep food on the table, about the way Bonnie had learned to hide and stay quiet, because that was what survival looked like. "I have one condition," Carter said. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "You build a policy, a real one, not just words on paper. No employee at any level gets used as a punching bag for people with money. Anyone who witnesses abuse reports it without fear of retaliation. You make it part of the culture, not just the handbook." Henry's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "That seems reasonable. And one more thing. Bonnie gets to watch the launch. Not from behind a door, from the observation deck, with a badge that says she belongs there." Done. The launch happened 2 days later. Carter watched from the observation deck with Bonnie beside him, not hidden behind a maintenance door this time, but standing in the open with a badge that said "Guest of the CO" in bold letters. The countdown reached 0. The engines ignited. The vessel rose on a pillar of fire and thunder, carrying 12 passengers toward a horizon most humans would never see. Bonnie squeezed her father's hand. "Dad? Are you still going to clean floors?" Carter smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in longer than he could remember. "I'm still going to work hard, sweetheart. But I'm not going to bow to bad people anymore. Not ever again." Across the observation deck, Henry Caldwell stood alone, watching the rocket disappear into the blue. Tearing up a $20 million contract had taken 10 seconds. Rebuilding a culture that valued human dignity over financial convenience would take years, maybe decades. But watching a father and daughter stand together in the light, instead of hiding in the shadows, made him believe that the work was worth doing. Some victories couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly reports. Some victories only showed up in the eyes of a child who had learned that good people sometimes won, and sometimes that was enough.